Our scripture lesson this morning is a reading from the Gospels, Matthew 10:34 through 39. And Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have come to bring peace, have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against his mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
I'd really like to thank Linda and the choir for singing that song. About a month ago, I came across that, and I just thought it was a profound and brilliant song that speaks to our world today. And then, of course, I had the crazy idea, Linda, can you sing this? And so thank you all. I mean, that's a really powerful song, really meaningful. If you get a chance to see the YouTube on it with the children singing it, it's a incredibly powerful song, and I'd recommend that you all look that up. But you all did a fantastic job with not an easy song, so thank you so much. One of the most controversial, misunderstood, and yet radically important lines of the Bible are Jesus' words. "Do not think that I come to bring peace, but I bring a sword." Now, I don't know about you, but this is the type of line that can make your head spin and question all that you think you know about Jesus. Think about it. Isn't Jesus the same person when he was born, the angels sang about peace on earth, that we proclaim as the Prince of Peace? The same person who on the Sermon of the Mount said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be the children of God." The same person who says, "Love your enemies, turn the other cheek, bless those who curse you." The same Messiah who, rather than violently overthrow Rome with a sword, chose instead to non-violently go to his death on the cross. If you're like me, I'm guessing the words, "I come not to bring peace, but a sword," probably make you feel, well, a little uncomfortable, and leave you wondering, why would Jesus say such a crazy thing? To understand this, we must first look at what's going on in the Gospel of Matthew. Up to this point, Jesus' ministry has been a huge success. Jesus has faced down the temptation in the wilderness, gathered disciples, delivered the Sermon on the Mount, healed the sick, stilled the storm, and even raised a young girl from the dead. The energy and enthusiasm around Jesus' ministry was contagious. Huge crowds followed him, and everyone, especially the disciples, were eager to get in on the action. Recognizing their zeal and preparing to send them out, Jesus gathers his disciples around him. Yet rather than give them a pep talk, Jesus delivers a series of warnings about the world they are about to face. So what does Jesus know that the disciples don't? From the moment that he took his very first breath to his very last, Jesus knew firsthand a culture of violence. A world, rather than denounce violence, had normalized it. Think about it. With his newborn eyes barely awake to the wonders of the world, Jesus finds himself being hunted by King Herod, a violent and powerful ruler who's trying to kill him. Still exhausted from their journey in giving birth, an angel appears to Joseph and says, and I quote, "Take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Think about that language. As Jesus' family flees, Herod realizes he's been tricked and orders every single child in Bethlehem that's 2 and under to be murdered. It is a brutal scene of mass genocide. Just days from birth, Jesus finds himself immersed in a culture that's drenched in the blood of innocent children. Seeking only safety and survival, Jesus and his family are forced to live as immigrants in Egypt and can only return home after Herod dies. If you don't think that God knows human suffering, just imagine what this homecoming was like for young Jesus. The boy who, when he tried to make new friends, quickly found out that he had no peers his age, since all of them had been killed. Returning home to a community that was still devastated by genocide, Jesus knew exactly why he was always the youngest kid in his class. He knew what it felt like to feel isolated, alone, and endure looks of sadness, shame, and scorn from his community. Indeed, from the very beginning of his life, Jesus knew the physical, emotional, and spiritual toll violence had on him, his family, his peers, and his whole community. Things only got harder as he got older. Growing up in Roman-occupied territory, Jesus watched anyone who challenged the empire be met with arrest, torture, and public execution. Spies were everywhere in ancient Rome. Rome didn't just kill its opponents, it made an example of them. The empire loved to nail rebels to the cross, let them die slowly, painfully, and publicly. God in Jesus enters a world not of peace, love, or harmony, but a violent culture of oppression, a culture that knew how to hate and where might was always right, a culture that solved its problems through force and war, where the tools of violence, militarism, and colonialism dominated, where innocent people, especially women and children, often got caught in the crossfire. While I'd like to believe that our world is different, sadly, the latest headlines from just this week reveal that we too are caught in a culture of violence. Let's look at just some of the headlines from this week alone. Just to sum up, from the BBC, more than 100 Gazans killed at food aid drop. From the LA Times, Ukraine troops ration ammunition. From CNN, the world's largest hunger crisis looms amid war in the Sudan. From the San Francisco Chronicle, why police chases are killing more Americans today than ever. From the Miami Herald, Dunkin' Donuts employee shoots customer. From the Albuquerque Journal, Albuquerque man accused of killing two women just a week apart. From the New Mexican, Plutonium Bomb Core passes key tests. Given his upbringing in this culture of violence, you'd think that Jesus would end up as a hate-filled, violent revolutionary. Certainly lines like, "Do not think that I come to bring peace, but to bring a sword," sound like a violent revolutionary, don't they? Yet Jesus isn't violent, and he isn't hate-filled, but rather he's a loving peacemaker seeking to create a revolution of love, justice, and compassion. In Matthew, Jesus in fact says, "Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies. When someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. Give to all who beg from you." So why does Jesus then say, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace, but to bring a sword"? As Jesus looks around at his disciples, preparing to send them out into this world, he knows that he's already given his main teachings on peace and love in the Sermon on the Mount. But he can see they still don't get it. Jesus recognizes that, like him, the disciples too have been shaped and conditioned by a culture of violence. Jesus decides to speak to them in terms that they will understand. Basically, Jesus says this: I'm going to use the language of violence to deconstruct a broader culture of violence that has not only shaped you, but that all of us have sadly normalized. So when Jesus says, "I come not to bring peace, but a sword," what Jesus is really saying is that my words, my teachings, my very presence as a peacemaker will be divisive and cut like a sword into the world of violence. My words of love will penetrate like a sword into the heart of a world that's been seduced by hate and anger. My words of peace will pierce like a sword into the world of war, revealing that violence only begets more violence, that an eye for an eye just leaves the whole world blind. My words of faith will cut through a world that loves to doubt. And most of all, when you live out my teachings as a peacemaker, you'll be misunderstood, you'll be considered divisive, and you'll even be violently attacked. When Jesus says his teachings on peace, love, and nonviolence will ironically be met with violence, he challenges us to embrace the paradox of his wisdom that shows that the whole world is upside down and backwards. Think about it. The people who possess and sell the weapons, who are the most violent, who have the greatest to gain and profit from wars, often make the nonviolent out to be the most dangerous. The greatest threats to the national security, to the peace, unity, and purity of society and religion. Isn't this, in fact, what the world did to Jesus? Isn't this what we did to Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Father Oscar Romero? Those who sought peace were considered the greatest threats and the most danger to all. Yet with such strong words, it's like Jesus in Matthew 10 is taking us disciples, looking us in the eyes, shaking us by the shoulders, and saying, "Wake up. Enough is enough. We must change our ways. We must stop normalizing violence. We must stop hurting people and start loving them." Jesus tells the disciples, "Look, I get it. When you start talking about peace and standing up for your beliefs in a culture of violence, even your own family is going to think you're crazy. You're unrealistic. You're impractical. It'll be easy to get discouraged by this world. It'll feel like things are only getting worse." But Jesus says, "Stay strong. Stay true to my teachings. And in the face of violence, remain peaceful. For that is the only way that you can show your family and all of those around you that a different path for this world is indeed possible. That violence is the unrealistic alternative to peace." Embracing Jesus' teachings, Martin Luther King Jr. says, and I quote, "Violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." As a Jew who knew the religious law inside and out, Jesus knows that honoring one's parents and family is one of the 10 great commandments and key to maintaining a healthy and orderly society, which is exactly why Jesus shocks the conscience by flipping this law on its head and saying, whoever loves father and mother, son and daughter more than me isn't worthy of me. Jesus says, look, I just talked to you all about a sword, but I can see you still don't get it. So I'm going to say something that literally strikes closer to home. I'm going to talk to you all about your family. Jesus says it doesn't matter how much you love your parents or your children if you aren't willing to follow my will and live out my teachings on peace, love, and justice. Following my teachings is the only way that we can change a culture of violence that we are all stuck in. Jesus basically says to us today, what good does it do to say that you love your children when we have normalized a culture that says it's okay for them to be shot by simply going to school? What good does it say that you love your parents when they can be killed by simply going to church, to work, the grocery store, or a movie theater? What about all those parents in Gaza, Ukraine, Africa, the U.S.-Mexico border? Don't they too deserve a world where their kids too can experience love, peace, and justice? Jesus says, follow me. Practice my peaceful and loving ways, for that's truly how you can show your family that you love them. That is truly how you can build a safer and more just world, not just for parents or for kids, but for all of us. Obviously, Jesus knew that being a peacemaker was also really lonely, which is also why Jesus is making an important point to us, that the community of faith is to be one's true family. For we are all part of a family that runs deeper than blood. We are part of God's family. That's what our baptism is all about. The presence of family in the biblical world, perhaps not all that different than today, was often a matter of survival. For there were no safety nets, no social support systems. So if you got sick, you got hurt, you lost your job, you were likely on the streets, dead, or maybe at best on your own. Jesus says no matter who you are or where you are from, you have a place in God's family. These words cut like a double-edged sword, as they both threaten an ancient society of privilege that valued the social hierarchy of bloodlines. Think about how power and privilege and wealth was passed down. But also they comforted. They comforted the outcast, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, who now accepted their rightful place in God's family. In laying out a new vision for his church in Matthew 10, Jesus says that we are to become God's true family, not just providing stability, love, and support, but also encouragement. Encouragement to live out Jesus' teachings on peace, love, and justice in the face of a culture of violence. While the disciples have had spectacular success to this point, Jesus tells them that it's now time to pick up the cross, a symbol of shame, pain, violence, humiliation, and public execution. For Jesus, discipleship is not about just adding another worthy cause to a list of our obligations, but it's about giving oneself to God. With the shadow of the cross hanging over us and the entire world this Lenten season, Jesus prepares us, knowing that when we speak of a new kingdom of love, peace, and justice, we will be met by an old kingdom, a violent culture, a war machine that's unwilling to relinquish power. Yet in the face of this culture, Jesus calls us to live peacefully, to engage in active nonviolence, to trust God, to trust that we're part of a bigger family, and to courageously go out into this world in peace. And today, I want to close my sermon with a story. It's a story that came to me from Father John Deere. It was a typical week in the United States, not all that different than the one you saw on the screen. On Monday, April 15th, 2013, two young brothers set off homemade bombs at the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring 260. People grieved and expressed outrage in the media, but all the while wars raged on in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. One of those who was killed at the finish line was 8-year-old Martin Richard from Dorchester, Massachusetts. Martin came with his family to watch his father cross the finish line that day. Martin was blown up instantly, and his mother and his sister were seriously wounded. The next day, friends released this photograph of young Martin smiling and holding a handmade poster with 2 red hearts and a peace sign. It read, "No more hurting people. Peace." Martin had made the sign in response to the racially motivated murder of Trayvon Martin, a young African American in Florida who was killed in a hate crime. Holding up the sign, young Martin wanted the violence to stop. John Deere recounts, "When I saw this photo, I thought, this is the voice of God speaking to us all. It is the cry of the world's children. This cry for peace should be our headline, our mantra, our communal wisdom, our goal, our public policy, our new bottom line. It should be the basis for foreign policy, religion, and politics from now on." Young Martin's photo should have been on the cover of Time magazine and the New York Times, but it got dismissed by the mainstream media because ultimately it was too serious and too powerful. It ran against our culture of violence, and violence sells. Peace does not. We cannot stir up people with a photo of a dead child calling for peace. They might actually take it to heart and do something about it. So today, sisters and brothers, I preach this sermon for 8-year-old Martin Richard, for my 3-year-old daughter Brooke, for my 13-year-old nephew, my 15-year-old niece, and for all the kids in our church, in our community, and in our world who deserve so much better. I preach this sermon recognizing that we are our child's future. For what we do today in terms of peace, justice, and care of creation will greatly impact the reality of our children and the future world that they live in. I preach this sermon today to invite you to seriously reflect on how a culture of violence has shaped you. How have you normalized violence? Been conditioned to accept violence as well acceptable? And to ask you to consider what you need to do to deconstruct this in yourself and in our community. I preach this sermon today to invite you to meditate daily on the wisdom of young Martin Richard, who stood with Jesus when he said, "No more hurting people. Peace." I preach this sermon today to ask you how you can be more nonviolent in thought, word, and deed. And I preach this sermon today to challenge you to actively support public policies that promote peace and justice locally, nationally, and in our world. While I know that these are huge tasks, my sisters and brothers, we owe this work not just to the children of the world, but to God. The same God who was born into a world of violence, but remained peaceful. The God who is undeterred in the face of impossibility. The God who can make a way out of no way. The same God who took up the cross, a tool of violence, death, and shame, and transformed it into a symbol of new life, hope, and love. The same God who says, "Bless you, my peacemakers, for you are my sons and my daughters. Remember your true identity and take up your rightful place in my family." Amen.